It is May 2nd, 2018. My name is Jenny Matz, and I have the honor of interviewing Nina Shah
Hi there.
here in Beverly Hills for the Interviews and Oral History of Television.
Thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to talk with us today, first of all.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm so thrilled to join the esteemed company of the people who have participated in this program. It's quite a stellar group.
And we'll talk about some of them then, your colleagues and
Yes.
clients. So we're just going to start off with some background information about you. What was your name at birth?
Nina Lorraine Shaw. I've always used my maiden name.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Harlem, New York. Do you want the year?
If you would like to state it for the record, we can
No,
just
I
say...
think people can look it up. That'll be my... Yeah, I was born in Harlem, New York. I'm a second generation Harlem resident. My mom was born in Harlem, but my family is originally from Charlottesville, Virginia. And it's a place that's very special to me because, like many people who migrated from the South as part of the big migration, it's very common to have spent the summers in the South. And I spent my summers in Charlottesville, mainly with my great-grandparents.
So what were your grandparents' names and your parents' names, and what did they do?
Well, I'll start in reverse order with my great-grandparents. Because my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother all had their children so young, my grandmother was only maybe 38 when I was born, and she was like in the wind. She was a nurse at the VA hospital in Brooklyn. Her name was Thelma, her maiden name Thelma Hardy, and at that point she was Thelma Onley. Onley's a big family name for us. And later in life, she became Thelma Davis after my grandfather died and she remarried. So she was kind of in the wind. She was, fly and fabulous and 40, and, we barely saw her except when my sisters and brothers and I would sometimes, because she lived very close to us, we would go to the train station and we would walk to the train station and meet her, and we would all yell, "Grandma, Grandma, Grandma." And she's like 45 years old. And it's like these three overgrown children just yelling and screaming your name. And she would always say, "Do you have to say Grandma so loud?" So I think in some ways her parents, her mother and father, were in many ways a much greater influence on me because I would spend my entire summer often with them in Charlottesville. And they were really kind of pillars of Charlottesville's Black society. First of all, they had been in the Charlottesville Glen Ivy, it's not Glen Ivy, it's Glen, I can't remember the name of the town, the adjacent towns for many years, for many generations. They had been, their ancestors had been slaves there in the surrounding area. After slavery, my 3 times great-grandfather walked from the plantation where he was enslaved. He was only 16. It was in Gooch County, and it was the Peyton plantation, which was a huge plantation. Many people enslaved there, and Peyton is a very common name for African Americans in Virginia because of that. So my 3 times great-grandfather, Evans Payne, walked from Richmond, from the plantation to Richmond. And his family had been enslaved on the Payne plantation for at least 3 generations that he knew of. He had been a slave there, his parents and his grandparents. So that would have taken them back probably to the early 1800s, late 1700s. So we were part of the enslaved people of this country for many, many generations. So he walked to Richmond. He became a day laborer, and he always told this story, which my great-grandfather always told me, about how he learned to read. He was working and he found a piece of a book in some debris, and he would save his money, and he got a young girl, an 11, 12-year-old white girl, to teach him a word every day. And this is how he learned how to read. And he was always so proud of it. And my great-grandfather would tell me this story all the time, a story that he sat on his grandfather's lap and heard, about how he had learned to read from this piece of book. He ultimately was able to go to college, and then he received an honorary PhD, and he was a very esteemed, very famous minister, the Reverend Dr. Evans Payne. He was a contemporary of many of the civil rights leaders of that era. In fact, I'm blanking here for a minute. He's been written about extensively, and my family history has been documented extensively. And when he died, it was front page news in all of the black newspapers in that part of the country because he had been the minister of his church for more than 50 years. And he was a very close friend and contemporary of Booker T. Washington's. And Booker T. Washington wrote about him quite a bit, and his big thing was financial solvency. So he started a savings and loan. So I came from quite a storied family, and I had a very good sense of kind of history of that family, and that we were very well-known, very respected people in that town. And everywhere I went, people would say, "Are you Miss Hardy's granddaughter?" And I would say yes, and everyone would point to me. So I really had this tremendous sense of my own place and self, which I think has carried me through the years.
Yeah. Was that any kind of pressure put on you to succeed in school or other accomplishments because of that history?
Absolutely, but not pressure in the way that I interpret your question. Pressure in the way of to live up to the model of these people. I mean, to not have been able to read until you were 16 years old, to have walked, more than a day to find a job, to have done all of these things. It wasn't pressure in the sense of, Nina, you better do this. It was more pressure of, how can I live up to the model of these people? How can I be a person who's worthy of having been a Peyton and a Hardy and an Onley, when those things meant a great deal?
So from an early age, what were your ambitions to live up to that?
Well, more than anything, initially I wanted to be like my great-grandmother, a seamstress. She was the most talented seamstress you could ever imagine. I mean, she could make everything. She made clothing that she would just drape on you. She upholstered furniture, and often we would go to in the town, we would go to the homes of white people, and we would reupholster their furniture in their homes. A lot of times we had done all the work, and so I would help her with that. I would thread the needle, and I would do all the hand sewing of the cords and the seams and things like that when I sat on the floor with her, and I was so proud of that. And she would make clothes for me or for others in our family, and I would make clothes for my Barbie. And I just thought that that was it. And as a result of that, I did a lot of sewing and needlepoint, and I learned all of those skills very, very young, and actually made most of my own clothing until I was out of high school.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then going back to your parents, what were their names and what did they do?
My mom is also a Thelma. She's Thelma Onley Griffith. She's actually still living. She unfortunately has Alzheimer's, so she actually thinks I'm one of her best friends now.
That's not bad.
Yeah, so that's not so bad. Although she did tell me quite interestingly the other day, she said that she was my friend despite the fact that I was quite a few years older than her. And her mom would not be happy about her having a friend who was so much older. But she liked me, and that's what counts. So she's not all here, but she was quite a force in her day. So my mom, like I said, born and raised in New York. She met my father, my biological father, in New York. She went from high school, and instead of going to college, which broke her father's heart, because my grandmother had gone to Hampton, which at that time was called Hampton Institute, Hampton University, and then she came to New York and she went to nursing school at Harlem Hospital. They have to remember I don't know if you can appreciate, as young as you are, just how segregated things were. So to become a nurse, you had to go to a nursing school for black nurses. And so she went in New York. So she went to nursing school at Harlem Hospital after she left Hampton. She and my grandfather who had done a lot of different work. His family owned a grocery store in Harlem, around 110th Street, just before what most people now think of as the borderline between Harlem and the rest of the city was still kind of like very uptown and very Harlem. And so the Onleys owned a grocery store there. It was my Uncle Bill, who was my grandfather's brother, and my grandfather, and my Aunt Clara, who was my Uncle Bill's wife. And they were very interesting people. I don't know a lot about them, except that they were kind of African American by choice, because they had such fair complexions that most people thought that they were not African American. And even now when people come to my home, I have a family picture up and everyone always looks at it and says, "Oh, I didn't realize your grandfather was white." And I say, "He's not. He didn't consider himself to be. He lived as an African American person, although a few of his brothers did not. But interestingly enough, they still kept in touch with us." So that was kind of an odd situation. I had an uncle who was like living as an Italian in Connecticut, like had changed his name to an Italian name, had a family. It was just crazy. It was insane.
And you had brothers and sisters?
I have a big family. There are 5 of us. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. One sister older than me and everyone else younger.
Aside from sewing, what were some of your other interests as a little girl?
I love to read. I learned how to read. I didn't really know how to read when I went to school, but I learned to read almost immediately. I went to PS 186 on 145th Street, and there was a library next door. I went to the library every single day. And I read until the library closed, and then I took books home. And my mom used to tell me all the time, "You are going to go blind if you don't stop reading." So I was one of those kids. I loved to read. I loved to draw and do puzzles. And I liked, like a lot of city kids, I loved to go outside and play and, do city games. You play, chalk games on the sidewalk. You do things like that. So, yeah.
Did you watch much television?
There wasn't a lot of television to watch, but I loved Saturday morning television. It was Mickey Mouse, it was Sky King and his niece Penny, The Adventures of Sky King and his niece Penny. And a few, there was a very rigid Saturday morning television lineup that I watched. In those days, a little history for everyone, there were very, very few people of color and African Americans on TV. So whenever someone was on TV who was African American, you would start yelling, "Come here, come here, come here," and everyone would run in the room to see it. And in fact, in the back of Jet magazine for the week, they would tell you what black people were going to be on TV.
Wow.
What Negroes were going to be on TV.
Do you remember seeing little Leslie Uggams on Sing Along with Mitch?
I did. I saw Sing Along with Mitch was my great-grandmother's favorite show. That and the Lawrence Welk Show. Don't ask me. So I saw all of those shows. I remember seeing East Side, West Side with George C. Scott and Cicely Tyson. And even though she was, I think, a secretary or something like that on the show, I just was like, she wasn't a maid, which was just such a relief. And yeah, so that was my introduction. I loved television. And like most families of that time, we only had one TV, and it was black and white.
Right, sure. I read somewhere you watched The Defenders.
I watched The Defenders. I loved all of those. Even then, isn't it funny? I loved Perry Mason. I loved The Defenders. I loved East Side, West Side. I loved all of those kind of procedural dramas or lawyer shows. So it must have been preordained.
Was there ever any inkling you would go into this field? Or when was the earliest you thought about it?
It's so funny because you hear so many horrible lawyer jokes, but in the community that I grew up in, there were a number of really respected professions. One of them, of course, was to be an undertaker, because an undertaker in a black community is a really insular kind of job because you only handle the remains of black people. So you're very much a part of the community and you're not dependent on anything outside of the community for your livelihood or well-being. So that, believe it or not, at that time was a huge kind of respectful job to have because you weren't dependent on white people. It was purely, so an undertaker, the ministry, a lawyer, a school teacher. Now, I didn't know any lawyers. I'd never met a lawyer. I'd only read about them. And you know, lawyers at that time, you know, people like Thurgood Marshall, they were just like, they were like superheroes. So to aspire to be that kind of lawyer, I thought that was the greatest thing in the world. When I used to hear like lawyer jokes when I got to be older, I was like, what? This is like a great job. And I still feel that way about the profession.
Yeah. So you went to college at Barnard and then Columbia Law School.
Yes.
Did you have was there any particular area of law you were interested in studying?
Well, I knew I couldn't be a litigator. I knew that whatever I did, it would be transactional, because I felt that my best subjects and my interests were more in structuring transactions, corporations, taxation. Those are the subjects that I enjoyed the most and I did the best in. So I felt that's where I would go.
Were there any professors you had that really made an impact on you?
A few, more so at Barnard than Columbia, because, you know, it was strange. Barnard was a really great experience for me, and I think going to a women's college, which I'm really high on, single-sex education for women, you know, you get to see women in such positions of leadership, and it allows you to think of yourself as someone who can be a leader. And I went to Barnard. It was interesting. I went to high school in the Bronx, which was, by that point my family had moved to the Bronx. Went to high school in the Bronx, which I went to a really, really tough high school. William Howard Taft, which even at that time had metal detectors to get in and out of the school. And this is like before there were metal detectors at the airport. Like you could get on an airplane easier than you could get into William Howard Taft High School. And then because a lot of the students would like go out and terrorize the community around the school, they padlocked the doors of the school from the outside. So if there had ever been a fire or anything, we would have all been in trouble. And but notwithstanding that, you know, and again, this I think speaks to the lack of opportunities for women in the workplace. There was such a good group of women who were teachers at Taft. And in fact, while I didn't know her then, years later I came to realize that Patty Felker, you know, who's a really incredibly respected lawyer, her mom was a teacher at Taft, at my high school. So, you know, you had these really brilliant women, many of them young Jewish women, who hadn't been able to go to law school and medical school as they did some years later, and they taught in these New York City public high schools. And because they were women, they often got the worst assignments, which were to teach in a high school in a low-income minority neighborhood. You know, all the guys reserved for themselves, you know, places like Bronx Science and the better high schools in Manhattan and the high schools on the Upper East Side and all of that. And the women got the worst assignments. But I also felt like they were the best teachers. And a big part of my going to Barnard, even though I was accepted at a number of other schools in New York like NYU and also Vassar and Bryn Mawr, was because one of my high school teachers went to Barnard.
And they must have really empowered the young women they were teaching. Too.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was kind of a weird situation where the impact of racism and sexism combined to give you a background that you might not otherwise have.
What about at Columbia? Were there many women studying law with you in your class?
No. I went to law school at a time when law schools were probably about 15 to 20% women. Now they're 50% and more. But at that time, no, there were not many, and there were not many African American women.
So what were you hoping to do when you left Columbia? What were your first jobs?
Well, actually, when first, you know, in law school you do summer internships, and one of my summer internships was here in Los Angeles at O'Melveny & Myers, the firm I actually ended up going to. Right. And at that point, I pretty much knew that I wanted to be in entertainment law, although I can't quite tell you that I knew what it was.
So explain. So entertainment law was not really the very popular area and that people are clamoring to get into now as it was then. So could you describe what the state of entertainment law was, what you knew about it, and why you chose that? It was a very prestigious firm, O'Melveny & Myers.
Well, I was fortunate enough to do well enough in law school that I was recruited by mostly upper tier firms, both in New York and in Los Angeles, which were the only two places I considered. I considered Los Angeles for several reasons, one of which was that my father was here, as well as John Shaw, as well as the rest of his family. They were originally from Chicago, and after he left the service, he and my mom met when they were both in the Air Force. Me and my mom was in the Women's Air Corps, and they met, and after they separated finally for the final time, he moved to Los Angeles, where his sister and brother and mother lived, had migrated from Chicago. So I was really close to the Shaws, and so coming out here was an option because I felt like I had family, and I really did. The Shaws took such good care of me in the first years that I was here, and then as I kind of 10 years out, they almost all started to die off, and none of them are living now.
Why entertainment law?
I had this sense, first of all, I was very influenced by a neighbor of mine. I was, like a lot of kids my age, I was doing a lot of babysitting jobs, and one of the people who I babysat for was a neighbor who was the publisher of Stereo Review. His name was Ed Hopper. He's still living. He lives in New York. He's quite an elderly man now. And I had such a keen interest in so many different things. And so, a lot of times he and his wife would come home, and I would just sit and talk to them about books I'd read, about things I was interested in. And as a result, he started to invite me to things at his job. Like he and his wife kind of became second parents to me. And in that time, and he worked for Ziff Davis, which, as you know, is a really, and so I got to know the Ziff family a bit, and through Ed and his wife, Ed and Jan, and I got to spend a lot of time in their offices. And at that time, I thought maybe I would go into music law, and then I kind of got to know a few people in music law, and I knew that was not for me. And plus, I liked television, I loved film, and I loved the stage. My mom was a big theater person. We used to go to the theater all the time. Or as I tell people, we used to see the second half of shows because we never had any money. So, the thing is to get to be friendly with the ushers, and then at the intermission, they'll let you in to stand in the back or even sit in seats that people haven't taken. So there's so many shows that I only saw the second half of that I would go home and read the first half.
That's on Broadway?
On Broadway, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In those days, because when you think about it, even now, the ushers for the most part tend to be elderly women. And again, another low-paying job. Whenever you see women in a lot of jobs, service industry jobs, they're low-paying jobs. That's why you see women in them. And at that time, a lot of black women had those jobs, which means they were even lower-paying jobs. And we would just go up and down the theater row, and my mom, we knew a lot of the people who worked, and my mom would just say, could we go in at intermission? And a lot of times they would even let us go in at a break. I mean, this would never happen now, but at the time.
Wow.
So
by contrast, it was 79 when you got to OMLV?
Yes.
Kennedy Myers. And I think they had just made their first African-American partner, William Copeland, I think.
William Coleman.
Coleman.
Yeah.
Were there other black lawyers or female lawyers in abundance there?
There was Gil Ray, Warren Jackson, Carl Robinson. So there's 3 black men. And then there was Cheryl, and then me.
And this is a firm with hundreds.
Yes. And then there was one other African-American woman who joined with me.
So no, not a lot in abundance.
No, not in abundance. 6, 7 of us in total.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was really a running joke because at that time the messengers had to wear blue blazers who delivered stuff. So that was always like, don't wear a blue blazer to work because people will be asking you for packages all day long.
Wow. No, I'm curious about some of the clients. They had some big clients.
Yes.
Was Tandem one of your early clients, Norman Lear?
Yeah, Norman Lear and Bud Yorkin.
And Yorkin.
Yeah, had this company, Tandem TAT. And Alan Horn, who I'm still very friendly with, was kind of a young, swinging executive there, in the sense of he was so dashing and, man about town. And so after a period of going through what they called rotation, going through several departments, I ultimately had my dream, ended up in the entertainment department. And at that time, it was me and one other, there was also an African-American man who came in with me, Eric Yeldell, who ultimately went to Fox and became a very prominent lawyer in his own right. So no, there weren't a lot of us at all. But you know, you kind of, in a weird way, you get used to there not being a lot of people like you. Like, you know, it's kind of like how I met my husband, because I met him in the elevator in the building 2049, right across the way from here. Because, you know, you don't really see that many African American men in suits at that time. So he was like one of two who I ever saw in my building, and we just started talking to each other, and ultimately we got formally introduced by one of my partners, and long story short, we ended up getting married. But honestly, you could go all day long and not see anyone, which is not good, and was not fun, and is not something I would long for, and not something I would want anyone to ever go through.
Did you sort of just take it as the way it was at the time, or did you find it hard?
It was the way it was at the time. Mm-hmm. There was no anything being different. Mm-hmm. I grew up in I grew up in Harlem of the 60s and 70s, which was enormously segregated. You never saw a white person in Harlem after 5 o'clock. When the stores closed, to the extent that there were white people owned stores, which they often did, mainly things like butcher shops, and you know, Harlem had a big Jewish population. There were still a lot of kosher butcher shops and things like that in the neighborhood, but after 5 o'clock, they closed the gates on those stores, and you never saw anyone. Mm-hmm. And you'd see little pockets of elderly, primarily Jewish women, who didn't have families of their own and hadn't had the money to move out of Harlem when Harlem became a black neighborhood. Right. And those were the only people you ever saw in Harlem.
So now, by contrast to how you grew up watching very few black faces on television, what Lear and Yorkin were doing was really making this the norm on television with shows like...
Certainly for that time, what they did was enormous, and I have tremendous regard for Norman and what Bud did. I was, at that point, a number of those shows had been on the air even while I was in law school, like the Jeffersons, so I knew about them. And Good Times. So, you know, to see those faces on television at the time was revolutionary. So yes, it was an amazing thing. And the other amazing thing about Norman's company was how many women were in it, which I did not appreciate at the time as being different. I thought that was the way things were, but the head of his business affairs was a woman, many people in the creative were women. It just was the way they were. I mean, they were all white women, mind you, but they were women nonetheless.
Right. What kind of deals did you work on? Were you working on contracts, employment?
I was totally working on contracts. And in fact, right now, that would probably be considered like production services work. But at the time, it was done in the law firm by a group of lawyers. And we sat and met with business affairs on a regular basis, talked about deals, got deal memos, and drafted long-form contracts. Spent a lot of time talking about the guild agreements, and I really learned so much about the law, about the union deals. Norman and Bud and that whole tandem TAT, they really created the business of syndication in a major way. So, and they called their syndication company, I think it was called Pitts, Pie in the Sky. And they syndicated all of those shows and did very well for themselves.
Were you involved with the syndication deals?
Absolutely.
What's to Viacom, right, from CBS?
Yeah, but remember, this is all, they were a standalone company, and you don't see that anymore. You know, you don't see individual companies that aren't corporate pods, or somehow, it's a very unusual situation to find a standalone company that both produces and distributes its own product.
Were there novel legal issues you were dealing with at the time?
Oh, absolutely, because there were so many things. For example, now we take for granted that someone might be in a show and then have a show of their own created, a la Cheers to Frasier. But Norman and Bud really created that. When you look at something like All in the Family to the Jeffersons. Remember, George Jefferson was Archie Bunker's neighbor. All in the Family to Maude. You know, Maude was Archie Bunker's cousin. And on and on and on. I mean, I could...
Sanford
I go on. And also this notion of taking formats. Sanford and Son was based upon an English television show called Steptoe and Son, I think it was called. And Norman and Bud took that format and grafted it on Red Fox and I'm forgetting his co-star's name.
But what were the legal issues you were dealing with?
Well, we were creating it all. Forget about legal issues. It's like, what how do you credit the people who created a show when it gets spun off into a new show? It exists now within the context of the union, but it didn't exist then. I mean, we were literally making it up. What happens when you take pieces of a show and create a new episode, compilation episodes? That was something. How do you compensate the writers? How do you compensate the actors? Those were all questions of first impression.
Right, so it's authorship issues.
Authorship issues, rights issues. Norman did some of the first holding deals, meaning putting talent into deals without a specific assignment. There was nothing in the union agreement that really addressed that. So you were not only negotiating with talent, but you were also negotiating with the union to try to figure out. Now those negotiations were a little bit above my pay grade, but I was still party to them and privy to what was being said and hearing and seeing them discussed in the context of it. So it wasn't as if we had these kind of big issues. We had whole areas of the law that we had to invent, which is, so much more.
And this might not have been something that was on your radar at the time, but in the 70s and 80s when negotiating talent deals, obviously the star is going to make more than supporting actors, but did gender and diversity play a role in salaries at the time?
In retrospect, of course it did.
Right.
Men made more than women,
Sure.
With the exception of something like Maude, obviously, where you had a woman clearly in the lead. But yeah, there was always a lack of and I think one of the things that really influenced my desire to be a talent representative is that, remember, I was sitting on the side of the table where I knew what everyone was making, and I also knew how much we were willing to pay. And I often felt that women and people of color were so underrepresented because I knew that there was a lot more for them, that wasn't asked for and wasn't obtained. Now that doesn't count the people who were very successful and went on strike, like some of the stars of Good Times did, to ultimately receive the higher end payments.
What about minors? Because you represented Facts of Life, right?
Well, Facts of Life was a big show, so I knew all of those laws and rules about how to hire minors and court approving their agreements and all the rest of that. So that was also interesting. And that kind of gave me my first glimpse into dealing with, minors and the issues that come up with representing minors.
What was your biggest takeaway from your time at O'Melveny and Myers?
Well, I came out of it knowing that I didn't want to work in a large firm. That becoming a partner in a large firm, even if it were something that would have been presented to me, which it wouldn't have been, it's not something I wanted.
Why?
I just didn't really see a place for myself. When I joined O'Melveny, there was one woman who was a partner. And I can't even remember her name. I'm so embarrassed to say. But we only called her by her title, Mrs. Diane. I can't remember her. At any rate, she was famous for having had 2 or 3 children and having not taken more than 4 weeks off from work. She was just
powerhouse.
And more and more women were starting to be made partners as I came to O'Melveny, and especially as I was leaving, but it was still so disproportionate.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so in 1981, you became a partner at Dern, Mason, Swerdlow, and Flume. It was at the time, right?
I actually didn't become a partner. I joined them as an associate.
Okay.
I became a partner in 1986, I recall. It was a year before I got married.
Okay.
So I went the path of it's a tried and true path of being an associate at a large, prestigious firm and then moving into the boutique firm community. Mm-hmm. Except for me, it didn't work as smoothly because, first of all, I truly didn't understand. I was still so naive in many ways, and I didn't understand that these were really about relationships. And I thought that just being good at what I did and just being smart and just coming from a great school and a great firm, that people would be like, I can't wait to be in business with her. And that wasn't even remotely the case. There were a number of firms who I won't name, although I must tell you people in those firms have done these, who basically didn't hire women. They just didn't hire women. They didn't say they didn't hire women, but they would have 1, maybe 2 women. I remember one of my one of the very prominent firms, even now, the head of the firm saying to me at one time, I'd hire more in the current day. I would have hired more people if I'd known. I was like, that's kind of BS. You went 10 years without hiring a woman. You didn't hire women. You just didn't say you didn't hire women. So, you have places that don't hire women. You think they were going to hire me? That was just, that was absurd for me to even think that would be the case, that I could have had a place in any of those firms.
So what was different about
Well,
Dern and Dell?
The difference is, one, it was Dixon Dern. And Dixon's an interesting person in many ways, but of many lawyers that I met over the years, he was much more focused on what you could do. He was much more, and I came from a firm that did a lot of the kind of work that he was just starting to do. He had taken on a client, D.L. Taffner, who, like Norman Lear, was using a lot of formatted British shows to, he had one, can't remember all the shows, but he had a number of shows, and he was using them, and he was, formatting them and turning them into, American shows. And so someone who had had that experience was to Dixon and my later partner, Ernie Dell, that was a big deal. And that's what they were focused with. So when I sent my resume to them, and there was an ad in the paper, and I sent my resume, they called me immediately. And honestly, most of the places I sent my resume to, I just got letters back saying that they had no interest in even seeing me.
Wow.
So,
what were your first impressions of Dixon first?
he's so idiosyncratic. He doesn't do it anymore now, but he used to smoke a pipe. And he had like a row of pipes on his desk. And he had this thing that you smash the tobacco into the pipe with. And he had this whole ritual. Oh, when Dixon sees this, he's going to be like, oh, Nina Shah. And it was like, tap, 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 tap. And I was just like, it was such a ritualistic thing. And now as I came to know him better, I could see, given his personality, that he needed that notion of. So I had a great conversation with him. Ernie Dell, I did not get a chance to meet because he was out sick. So I only talked to him on the telephone, but it was just the two of them in the entertainment department. And I remember Ernie will tell the story, I think, because we talk about it from time to time. So I talked to Ernie on the phone, and I said, listen, let me just tell you, because if you're not going to hire me, I don't want you to have a good conversation with me and then meet me and feel like I kept something from you. I said, so if you don't hire African Americans in this firm, just let me know now. And he said, oh, no. What was he going to say? Yes, I don't. But he couldn't have said that, but then he could have not. And he said, no, I would never not hire you for that reason, and you sound great. But at that point, I was so tired of looking for a job. And so knowing that this is why people weren't hiring me, I mean, why wouldn't they hire me, right? Columbia Law School, O'Melveny, my peers were getting hired. They were getting interviews. I wasn't even getting interviews.
Were you resentful at all?
No, not resentful in a way that I think it was the way things were. It just meant that door was closed to you. I didn't have like this, oh, this is so unfair. This is so horrible. This is life. Everything that happened in life before that had prepared me for this. It wasn't like society had open doors. No one had open doors.
Right.
And O'Melveny and the other large firms understood that they, as large institutional hires, couldn't discriminate and had to join this rising tide of women and people of color coming into the workplace. But the small firms, please. Even now you have small firms that are almost majority men and majority white men. Nothing has changed in that sense.
Well, it sounds like they weren't even trying to be trailblazers. They just had a pragmatic
Well, first
attitude.
of all, they were hiring people who they knew. So they were hiring the sons and daughters, in some cases, daughters, of people who were, I remember being, I got to one place where they did consider hiring me, not really hiring me, but they were going to consider interviewing me. I got a letter back saying I was going to get an interview. And then maybe I scheduled the interview, and before I got there, they canceled it. And they said they had hired someone else, and they had legitimately hired someone else, and I know him very well, but he had a father who was a very prominent person in the entertainment industry, and even though he had not gone to an Ivy League school or interned at a large institutional respected firm, he got that job.
Mm-hmm. So did they ever tell you what they saw in you for Dern and Dell?
I think by the time I got to them, I was just so like to the point, you know, this is what I can do, this is how I can do it. If you don't hire women, if you don't hire black people, just let me know. Because at that point, I actually thought I was going to have to, I was going to either have to try to see if I could get into a corporation, or I was going to have to start my own firm.
Right. And we'll get into a minute that you did just that, but before that, any memorable clients or deals you put together while you were at that firm? I know you represented.
Well, you know, it was very interesting because one of the very first, there were two sides of it. On the television side, and I was so fortunate, and he died recently, and I owe him so much, but the actor Robert Guillaume. Robert Guillaume was the star of a show called Benson, and Benson was a big, solid network hit. And he was a big, solid network player. He was an Emmy nominated. And he hired me to be his lawyer. So the way I became his lawyer, which was very, you know, I got fixed up on a blind date with this guy who was in the Warner Brothers writers program. And so we went on this date, and I was like, clearly we didn't want to date each other. But I said, because he was a writer, I said, if you ever need a lawyer, I would really like to be your lawyer. So a couple of years later, he comes and he has an offer. Comes back to me. His name is Bill Boulware, my very first client. And Bill has an offer to be on Benson. And this is like a scale writer deal. And the guy who made the deals for Witt Thomas Harris, the production company, was really like, I can't remember his name, but he was a contemporary of Dixon's, and he was just like one of these guys who just started yelling and screaming at you the minute he picked up the phone. And I was so determined to make a better deal for him than a scale deal, which now I realize was totally ridiculous, that I was just screaming at him in return. And so Dixon called him and said to him, basically, you're going to give her, like another 5%. And he said, just do it. So he said, okay, Dixon, I'll do it for you. And so I was like a big hero. And so he went to work on Benson. And as it turns out, this particular Bill and Robert's wife, Donna, and I were all kind of in this little group of black people in Ivy League colleges, which I know sounds kind of weird, but there's actually, if you go into one of these schools, like the degrees of separation are so close, so small, that if you went to one school and then another graduate school, that you could practically know every black person in the Ivy League circuit. So Robert's wife, Donna, had gone to Vassar. So she was like in my Seven Sisters circuit, because it was like an association of black women in Seven Sisters schools. So she and I were in that together. And I got to know her more, and she said, you know what, I'm going to introduce you to Robert. And she introduced me to Robert, and she was like, Robert, you should really hire Nina. One, because she's smart and she's good and all the rest of that, but listen, this is what you're about. So Robert hired me, and I'll never forget it because his lawyer at the time, I don't recall his name, wouldn't send me Robert's files. He was like, you're going to be fired in about 6 months. And then you'd have to pack up the files and send them back to me.
And usually that's professional courtesy.
It's a law.
It's a law.
It's a law. Not professional
So he just
courtesy.
refused?
He just refused. And he sent them eventually because he saw that Robert wasn't going back. But I'll never forget that. So Robert became my first big client. And that was a big deal for me, that to have someone who was a star of a television show. And that kind of led to other people, me becoming better known and me getting other clients. But it was really all Donna.
And this blind date.
And this blind date, Donna and Robert.
Can you explain, what is a scale deal?
Scale deal is the minimum amounts mandated by the collective bargaining agreement.
Okay, and you were able to get that extra 5%.
Actually, it's almost always scale plus 10 for the agents, so scale plus 10 plus 5.
Ah, nice.
Yeah. So, yes.
Any major or difficult deals you did for Robert that you recall?
No, because Robert was a star.
Yeah.
It's easy to do the deals for the stars. It's the other deals that are harder to do. I mean, when it's easy to do in the sense of a star demands a certain level of deal. So it's just being knowledgeable about what that deal should look like. And of course I was knowledgeable. I'd been sitting on the other side of watching those deals for years. I knew what all the stars on all the tandem TAT shows made. I knew what all their perks were. You know, I had a tremendous base of knowledge.
How transparent were those factors at the time?
Well, I worked for the, you know, I was a lawyer for the company. All
Right.
that information was open to me. And I always had good relationships with my peers, with the lawyers who I worked with. I could pick up the phone and talk to anyone in another law firm, people in other production companies, and as we do now. That hasn't changed any.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So doing re-up deals for Benson, I mean, was there anything specific he wanted, or?
Well,
that
you know, Robert was really someone who was such a, I wish, you know, because of health reasons, he wasn't as active in his final years, but this was a man who was such an advocate for, such a civil rights advocate in his work. You know, he really insisted that writers of color be hired. He just, I
Was
mean,
that actually in his deal, or did
no,
he
it
just
wasn't,
influence?
but he influenced it. He just went and said, this has to happen, which is in large reason why my friend got hired. My friend / client got hired. So Robert was just an incredible person. There were other interesting things over time I did for Robert because, you know, he went from Benson to his own show to, you know, he went to different shows. He had a long history on Broadway, so he did stage work. He did a lot of different work over the years. In terms of a deal that I would say seminal at the point I became a member of Dern Mason, Swerdlow and Floam, was two young men came to see me. It was really quite interesting because I think if one of them had not been Canadian and the other one,
Roman and
yeah, and the other Latin American, or he was really Cuban, but Latino, they probably would have never hired me because they would have known better. And they had gotten the story of this teacher in South Central LA, or East LA, Jaime Escalante. And Jaime was very well known for having introduced this rigorous math program into his high school, and a controversy that came about because as his students did well on standardized tests, it was believed that they weren't really doing this high level of math work. And that really became the movie Stand and Deliver. But it started as an American Playhouse project. At that time, American Playhouse Television actually allowed filmmakers to bring projects to them, and then you could carve out a theatrical window that preceded the television window. But American Playhouse paid for it. So I made the American Playhouse deal. I got the theatrical window. We made the movie, and then we sold it to Warner Brothers for its theatrical distribution. And so that was a very intricate deal, because first I had to make the American Playhouse deal.
right.
I had to carve out the window and all the stuff that goes with it and make essentially a low-budget feature film, but it wouldn't have happened but for television. And so many filmmakers, people who we identify as filmmakers and projects that we identify as seminal films, really came out of that American Playhouse model.
What are some of the most important factors to you to secure for a client any kind of a deal, a creative deal like that?
Well, in that case, one of the things that I was really very proud of in that deal, which some 15 years later became more of a standard, is that I was able to obtain a favorable definition such that a number of revenue streams were counted for purposes of break even, which allowed my clients to reach a point of, I'll just use the term profitability, much earlier than they would have if things had been. And it was really the point when videos were just happening. And at that point, videos were only accounted for on a royalty basis. Now this is almost a standard thing. Everything was royalties. The royalties were very small, and they were only on a piece of the compensation. And I went to Warner Brothers and convinced them, which they said they would never do again, and they didn't do again for many years, that they should count all of the revenue towards break even for purposes of putting our clients into profits, and then they could count it at the regular rate. And now that's a very standard deal, but I know I made one of those first deals.
In other words, they would get an upfront from that direct
No,
profit?
they would actually, what would happen is, you know, when you think about how one calculates profits in a deal, it's money's in, money's out, right? What do you count as money's in? What do you offset against money's in as money's out? And it's the difference. To the extent that money's in exceed money's out, that's the profit.
Right.
So the issue is, if you're on the studio side, you want as few things as possible to be in the money in column and as many things as possible to be in the money out column. And if you're sitting on my side of the deal, you want as many things as possible in the money in column and as few things as possible in the money out column.
Right.
And that was really it.
And that's the line to negotiate.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you set a standard that they were like, shoot, we shouldn't have done.
We shouldn't have done that. We shouldn't have done that.
So in 1989, Durandal Basin, it dissolved. The firm dissolved, and you
Yeah, at that
formed
point,
your own.
we had grown to be quite a larger firm. We had a litigation department, we had a corporate department, we had a labor department, and Ernie and I and Mike Rubel, we had this dream of having a firm that was really much more just a transactional entertainment firm. Mm-hmm. And so primarily it was Ernie Dell, Michael Rubel, who's now a partner at CAA, and myself, and we started this firm.
How did you decide what other partners to bring in?
It was kind of an interesting story because we just kind of said, we'll leave. We're leaving, and we'll just fare on our own, and then people wanted to join us. Mm-hmm. So originally we thought we would only be about the 3 of us, 4 of us, because Greg Darren was also part of that group. Got to give him credit. And we thought maybe 1 or 2 younger lawyers would follow us. And in fact, the firm split and ultimately dissolved because so many people wanted to work with us.
Mm. Was diversity ever a factor in who you wanted to work with on your team?
Well, yes, it's everything. Mm-hmm. Because I would never want to be in an environment that wasn't open to people like me. So even at the very beginning, Jean Tanaka, who's an Asian American woman, joined us. We always had, from the very day we opened our door, we had a fairly diverse group of people of color, women, the whole bit. We were different always from the outset, and as we have matured over the years as a firm, this is very important to me. This is, I always say to people when they ask me, I say, it's like the air I breathe. So I come in here every day and I can take deep breaths and I can be comfortable because I'm in a place that is a place that I want to be and looks like a place I want to be. And the thing that always confuses me, is the only way I can explain it, is how people can breathe in those other rooms.
What about the clientele that you decide to represent? Is it a factor there too?
It's less of a factor. I think, the hardest part, I think, for me sometimes in being the lawyer that I've grown to be, and I think you can tell even when I talk to you about deals, I am really enthusiastic about the work I do. First and foremost, the work I do is what has driven me. My interest in the work and I think my skill set has driven me. But I've often had to fight first the battles of diversity and inclusion because I can't get to the work without them. It would be so nice, I think I heard Sidney Poitier say once in an interview that some days he wanted to just be an actor. But he couldn't just be an actor, he had to be an actor and a civil rights advocate. Now I am proud of my advocacy, and I would not imagine my life in any other way. But I do think about sometimes, what if I could be like my peers, many of my peers, and I could just get up every day and be the best lawyer possible. I still strive to do that, but I have to make room for all of these other things.
So you feel that sense of social responsibility and advocacy all the time?
All the time. Every minute of my life, every minute of my day.
Hmm. Did you have, with Ernie Dell, when you decided to form this company, any kind of overarching goal or mission of what you wanted to accomplish that would distinguish you guys from other firms?
Well, we always knew that we would be a diverse and inclusive firm. And I really give Ernie and Michael Rubel a lot of credit because there was no other option for me. This is who I was and I could not be anything else. They were white men, they had other options. And in fact, a number of people in the business, a number of very prominent agents, for instance, had really counseled, perhaps Ernie more so than Michael, but had counseled both of them that they could make alliances with them with other men and that they would be far better served as lawyers and in their career in those kinds of alliances than they would be in a law firm with me.
Interesting.
So one of the decisions that they had to make, and when I talked to them about it, and Michael and Rubel and I in particular have talked about it this recently because he's kind of going through a career transition himself, that he didn't think there was any other choice. But I always marveled at the fact that they didn't think there was any other choice, and they kind of linked arms with me and went out. But that was not something that people in our business were uniformly supporting or counseling them. Like kind of their wise rabbis were saying in some cases, well, why do you want to do that? Or why don't you want to do this? And why her? And who is she?